Blind Nil Audio.
At 12 years old, 12, Kevin Dahlstrom sat at the kitchen table and actually did the math. How long would his family survive before the money ran out? Kevin's father, a lifelong promoter, didn't believe in banks. Instead, he kept his money in gold and diamonds locked away in a safe. And Kevin decided right then and there, at 12, that he wanted something different. He wanted stability. He wanted control, and he spent decades making sure that he got it. Greetings, my friends. I'm Carl Richards, and this is 50 Fires. And the irony of Kevin's story is that even after building wealth and freedom for himself, Kevin still sees people worth 9 figures, in fact, who are trapped. They keep grinding, keep working, not because they have to, but because they have given money a job it cannot do. And we're going to talk about that in depth in this episode. Kevin also, another thing I've loved about watching Kevin's work is Kevin is not afraid to call people out online for what he thinks are bad financial takes. In fact, when Ramit Sethi said that homeownership was a bad investment, Kevin didn't just disagree. He actually built a website, hired a team, ran the numbers so that you could do that yourself. And guess what? The math says Ramit was wrong. This is 50 Fires, and today I'm excited to bring you a conversation with Kevin Dahlstrom about breaking free financially, mentally, and maybe even physically. So let's dive into my conversation with Kevin Dahlstrom. So Kevin, so fun to finally meet.
Likewise.
Kevin, you know what would be fun for me is to back up a bit. I'm actually really curious because I haven't seen you talk much about this, and I may have missed it, but I haven't seen you talk much about it. What's your earliest memory of money?
Wow. That's a great question. To be honest, the first thing that comes to mind is not a positive feeling. So I grew up in a pretty chaotic environment. It was one of those situations where we had money, we didn't have money. We had money, we didn't have money. So the word that comes to mind, Carl, is instability. And from a very young age, I remember that was a huge stressor for me. I guess maybe when I was like 10 or 12 years old, I was a pretty smart kid, good at math. It began to dawn on me that we didn't have stability. And I remember longing for stability. My dad was an old school entrepreneur. He actually referred to himself as a promoter, not an entrepreneur. So that probably gives you a feel for the type of guy he was. So he never once in his life had a traditional job. And I remember I just longed for him to be more like the other dads. And of course, what I didn't realize is there were also advantages to growing up in that environment where, ideas were valued and anything was possible. But I do distinctly remember that was a big stressor in my life as a kid, is just that feeling of insecurity around money.
I'm so curious about this because that word is so strong, right? And what's interesting to me is here we are 45 seconds into a conversation about money, and you say not a positive feeling, right? Like so often we think a conversation about money is about a spreadsheet and calculator. It's a math problem, isn't it, Kevin? Right? And the first thing we get into is this feeling. So tell me, you said it dawned on you like 10 or 12 years old. Like how did it dawn? How did you know things were unstable?
Well, first of all, I have to say kudos, Carl, because you warned me that we would delve into topics I haven't talked about before. And I said, boy, that would be hard to do. And first question, you've already done it.
Yeah.
So, the way it dawned on me is, as I said, I was a pretty sharp kid and really good at math. And I was literally doing the math in my head because I had a pretty good sense of my parents' financial situation. And it really troubled me that we essentially had no savings. I actually distinctly remember, I've never talked about this, but I distinctly remember like doing the calculations around how many months I would like my parents to have in savings to cover our living expenses, which I recognize
Really?
is very odd for a 12-year-old or whatever. But I do, and
Yeah.
honestly, that did very much inform the way I handled money later in life. I sort of went to the other extreme, even though I've also been an entrepreneur for a lot of my career. I kind of went to the other extreme and have always been very adamant about no debt, living below my means. Like that's how I sleep well at night. And it's probably a direct result of my upbringing.
That's amazing. So you remember calculating the months.
I do. I do.
Tell me, just because I'm curious, like what were you using? Like a calculator and a notepad at age 12, or what
Yeah.
were you how did you actually do it?
No, it's funny, man. You're bringing back some memories that I haven't thought about in a while, but I actually remember sitting at the proverbial kitchen counter one time with my dad and we were having dinner. And I was asking him a
Wow.
bunch of questions around our spending, how much money he had in savings. And he was pretty transparent with me. Now, just so you know, the kind of environment I grew up in, it was very non-traditional. So my dad was extremely distrustful of financial institutions and government. So
Wow.
he never had a loan. He never had a credit card in his life. He kept all of his savings, if you want to call it that, in a safe in his bedroom. He had gold and diamonds. Those were his only investments, really. And so it was a very unusual upbringing as it relates to money. And as an offshoot of that, he was pretty transparent. Like I kind of knew our full situation. And his
Wow.
income was all over the place, right? There was like long stretches with no income, and then he'd make some great money, and then that would be gone. And it troubled me also that my dad didn't seem to worry about it. And in a
Wow.
way, looking back now that I'm 54 years old, I look back on that and I actually kind of have respect for him for that. Is
Yeah.
he was kind of an easy come, easy go person when it came to money, and would, even though we didn't have a whole lot, he wouldn't hesitate to spend, especially on experiences. And that's something that I preach about a
Mm.
lot these days myself is
Mhm.
optimizing for experiences. And that's where if you're going to invest your money, don't invest in things, invest in experiences.
Yeah. What of that have you taken into conversations with your spouse or family? Like how has that informed the way you've handled money in your home?
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's manifested very directly. I've always been extremely conservative. As I said, my wife and I have never had debt. In fact, today we have no debt even on our home. So, like, you could even argue it's um, you know
Right.
to our detriment that we don't use debt. But I know that it's a direct result of my upbringing. But I will say, like, being conservative financially, um, you can see it being passed on to the next generation. And I think my kids appreciate it. They know that mom and dad are pretty conservative and pretty good with money. And I think
Wow.
that brings them the peace of mind that I didn't have, which makes me feel really good. Um,
Yeah.
and hopefully I'm passing some, hopefully we're modeling some of those lessons. I will tell you, so, unlike my dad, I, throughout my long career had consistent and very high income for a long time. And so we've done extremely well financially. But I think my kids also appreciate in a way that we don't live like it. Right. So I
Mm.
mentioned living below, at this point in life, we live like at the extreme, way, way, way below our means. And
Mm.
to the point where my kids are, so like, occasionally they'll ask a question, like expressing concern about our financial situation, and I have to actually reassure them that no,
Right.
we're okay, and actually you're okay for the rest of your life also.
Yeah. So good. What let me ask you about this little statement you made about the house and the mortgage. Because I'm really curious about this. Because we all say that, right? Like if you've paid off your mortgage, you almost always say something like, "Oh, we know that that might not be the smartest thing."
Right.
Like, and we're pointing to kind of like the spreadsheet that everybody builds, and
Right.
you're well aware of this, like just an opportunity cost, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I could borrow money at 3.5%,
Sure.
I'm going back 2 years. If I could borrow money at 3.5% and I could invest it at something more than 3.5. But Kevin, I've actually been to mortgage payoff parties, right? I've never been to an efficient markets portfolio party.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like there's something really intrinsically important about understanding that's not just a spreadsheet
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. First of all, just how you feel about it. And then that little comment of like to our detriment. Like, how do we
Yeah.
process that?
Well, what you're getting to is what I call the second order benefits of some of these decisions. So, the
Mm,
first order benefit is clear, right? Like you don't have a payment every month, you're not paying interest to anybody. But of course, that can be debated, right? Because a mortgage is the lowest cost capital, lowest risk capital that debt that you'll ever take on. It allows you to leverage most people's largest asset, which is their home, which multiplies the return when your home goes up in value. It multiplies the return. But there are second order benefits to not having debt. One of which is just peace of mind, but one that people don't talk about very much is the ability to be opportunistic. When you have
mm,
no debt and you have a low burn rate, it allows you to pursue opportunities that you otherwise couldn't. Because the classic example being like you've got a mortgage payment, you've got 2 car payments, you've got kids in school, whatever. You've got a burn rate that's pretty hefty. Let's say it's $10,000-$15,000 a month. You've got to have at least that level of income at all times. And so that in many cases, that changes you to a traditional 9 to 5 job. Whereas if your burn rate is extremely low, then you don't have that nut to cover every month, and you could be opportunistic when things come along.
mhm,
I mean, that's actually been a big part of the calculus for me several times in my life. For example, when I've started a company.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's really, really smart. And it's interesting to me how important that can be early on, right? Establishing sort of the habit of being opportunistic so that you don't feel. I was just having this conversation actually with a close family member of how many people feel stuck and how easy it is and how much empathy I have for the idea of like, I can't go do that.
Right.
Like that's nice of you to say, but I can't
Yep.
take I'm working 2 jobs. I get home, we've
Totally.
got dishes to do, we've got the homework to do. I can't go create something,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah. And the one thing I'd say about the house in particular is like the good thing about a house is it's a wealth builder. Like it's a fact. This isn't, people do debate this, but it's a indisputable fact that home ownership has been the biggest driver of wealth in America um, in the past 100 years, hands down. Nothing else even comes close. The real wealth destroyers are other things, other big um, expenses or assets like cars. Cars are the number one wealth destroyer. So, I still to this day, and this is a great example of where we started around my mentality from childhood. The car I'm looking at right outside my window right now is a 15-year-old truck with 180,000 miles on it. That's my daily driver. It's the only car I
So good.
have. And
Yeah.
I, because I've always had this mentality of like, I don't want to put my money into any assets that decline in value. And cars are the number one offender. So if you want to build wealth, owning your car and driving, a not so nice car if you have to is the like step one in my mind.
Yeah. That is funny. I seem to recall you debating that with somebody on X about or Twitter, whatever we call it these days, of the home ownership thing. Did you get in some
Oh yeah.
conversation
So
with maybe with Ramit?
yes, and he's dead wrong on this, by the way, because it's just like again, I'm a math guy. It's just pure math. And by the way, the end result of that online debate, I actually hired a team and I built a website called ultimatehomecalculator.com
I
that
saw
allows
that.
anybody. It does all the math. It factors in everything. It allows you to compare apples to apples, home ownership versus renting, because there's a lot of factors and some of them are pretty subtle. It's the only calculator out there that factors in everything and allows you to compare. Now, what's interesting is in the interest rate environment we're in today, there's actually a lot of scenarios where renting does make sense. But in any low interest rate environment, certainly home ownership is by far it's the number one way to build wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Ramit and I have been friends for a long time, and that's been always something that we've argued about. And the second thing is he always gives me grief about owning a Ford F-150, but I have to explain to him like I use it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's not just
Exactly.
like I go to the desert and the mountains with that truck. So it's more than just a fancy toy that
Well,
you drive around.
I have to make one comment. Like with a lot of these personal finance influencers, I don't
Mhm.
think I'm saying anything that's going to surprise anyone, but they have to say sensational things to get attention. Because the truth is, like, building wealth is actually pretty boring. It's like doing boring things really well for 30
Right,
years. So they have
right,
to say
right.
sensational things like you'd have to be crazy to own a home, which is dead wrong and does damage to their audience, but it
Yeah.
gets clicks and eyeballs.
We'll be right back with more from 50 Fires. Welcome back to 50 Fires. You know, it would be fun. The team and I went through a bunch of the stuff that you had written and said over the years, and we came up with what we're calling Kevin's most provocative opinions. And
Can't
we
wait.
named them. And what's funny about this is they're not really all that provocative when they're so commonsensical that they're provocative.
Yes.
Like, let's put it that way.
Well, common sense is
So
no longer common, unfortunately.
totally. Common sense is controversial. So let me pick a couple here.
Sure.
And I'll give you quotes from you. Let's start with what we called opinion number 3. We called it maximalist minimalism.
Yeah.
And here's the quote. Here's something you said that I'd love to hear about. True minimalism is about creating space to gorge on what truly matters. It's not about sacrifice. So obviously, minimalism almost always gets framed as sacrifice, but you seem to see it as a way to create room for abundance. So
Yeah.
talk to me about this maximalist minimalism
Yeah.
opinion.
Great topic. So, most people misunderstand what minimalism is really about. Most people think minimalism is about like denying yourself of joy, of living like a monk. And it's actually closer to the opposite of that. What minimalism is about is asking of everything in your life, does this bring me joy or not? And if it doesn't bring you joy, then move it out of your life to make room for more of what does bring you joy. So, in that sense, I often say this is the maximalist part. I often say that minimalism is mildly hedonistic because it's about making room to just gorge on the things that bring you joy. I'll give you a simple example from my own life. So, I did a reboot of my life about 6 years ago, which I've written about extensively on X/Twitter. And the whole point of it was to make room for something that brings me a lot of joy, which is rock climbing. I'm a really committed, serious, passionate rock climber. And so when I rebooted my life, we moved to Boulder, Colorado. So I can look out the window right now and I can see the rocks that I'll be climbing tomorrow. I opened up my schedule.
Kevin, where did you move from?
From Dallas, Texas.
That's right, Dallas.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Far from the
Keep going.
rocks.
Yeah.
But I also reoriented my life to allow time to gorge on rock climbing. So my life today is very simple, but it is actually kind of hedonistic because I spend most of my time doing things that I absolutely love. I mean, I joke to my friends, but I'm really not joking that I've got the best life of anybody I know. And it's true. And the reason is because I got very deliberate about that. So, I was the classic example of the guy who, when I was young, put my head down. I was a grinder, worked my way up the corporate ladder, started some companies, all the classic tropes. And at some point, I realized that I was on a hamster wheel where just I was running faster and faster, but not really getting anywhere in life. And so in my case, this epiphany happened in my mid 40s, and I did a major reboot of my whole life, like changed everything. I think for most people, it doesn't need to be that dramatic if they're deliberate.
Yeah, this is a really important subject, and I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on 2 things. One, how did you get clear about that? Like, what was the process? Because this is not easy to do,
Yeah,
and there's so much, pressure, mimetic
totally.
pressure, and especially given Instagram, like to get clear about what you really want, right?
Yeah.
Versus what your parents want or what your neighbors
Yeah.
want or what people tell you. So one, how did you get clear about what you wanted? And the second thing I'd like to just talk a little bit about is like the it had to have been painful and hard to get off the hamster wheel.
Yes. All
So
true.
talk to
Okay.
me about those two things.
Yeah. So I think to your first question of like, how did you have this epiphany? In my case, and I think this is the case with many people, there has to be something that's a catalyst or like the red pill that wakes you up to these truths. And for me, it was rock climbing. So I
Hmm.
started climbing way before I moved to Boulder 25 years ago. And it clicked with me from day one, not just the act of climbing itself, which is great. It was everything about it. It was the places it takes you. It was the people. I often say that I came for the climbing. I stayed for the community. And
Right.
that was my red pill. It really opened my eyes to this whole other world that I didn't even know existed, where um, your value wasn't based on your job title or the size of your bank account. And so that was like it's one of those things that happened slowly, then all at once. It was slowly chipping away at me, and I slowly lost interest in playing the corporate game, even though I was winning big time in the corporate game. Just other things became more important to me, namely time outside, time with a different type of person. And so,
How did that, Kevin? Sorry to interrupt you,
yeah,
but how did that happen? Right. So did you just happen to go climbing one day? Like, how do you
yeah,
expose yourself? Put your like this is the one of my friends phrases it this way. I love it. Like, how do you systematically put yourself at risk for
yes,
good things to happen?
yes,
Right? Like, how
yes.
did that happen?
Or another way to put it is, how do you increase your surface area for
Sure.
serendipitous things to happen?
Yeah.
In my case, it literally, I'd always been intrigued by the idea of climbing. It just looked cool. And I've always been athletic. And so in my case, a friend of mine invited me to go to a gym in Dallas, Texas. And it was, for me, it was one of those, like from the first day I went, I was hooked,
Hmm.
completely. And
Hmm.
slowly it began to consume more and more of my life
Hmm.
and ultimately led to that major reboot. But to your broader question, because I love the question you asked around like, how do you systematize that, right? How can
Hmm.
others take the red
Hmm.
pill? And I do think it is exposing yourself. Like you have to increase your surface area. You have to get out of your bubble. You have to meet different types of people, try different things. You have to have a huge bias toward yes. Otherwise,
Hmm.
you're
Hmm.
always going to be in the matrix, right?
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not easy. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's so good. And I want to be clear. I often have to remind myself and listeners, like, this isn't about climbing,
no, not at all.
right? Like because I want to talk lots about climbing because I live in the mountains
Yeah,
for the same reason, except mine is more alpine style, ridge work, both on skis and on in trail running shoes. So I mean, I've been on the flat
yeah,
irons, right?
yeah,
So we share all of that, but it's not about climbing. It's about just because so many people struggle with this right now that like there isn't, in fact, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you can see somebody from across the room that is up to something.
yeah,
You know what I mean? There's
yeah,
like
yeah.
this slight mischievousness in their eyes.
Totally.
It's really rare.
Yep.
And most people, and especially as you approach, like I'm 52, we're about the same age. I would imagine you're having these conversations I'm having, which are increasingly I have people show up in Park City because they read some of the work. They want to meet for coffee. They look around to make sure no one's listening. And then they show me some evidence of winning, like a balance
Yeah.
sheet or an income statement. Then they look around again to double check and they say something like, is this all there was?
Mhm.
Right? Is this what it was really for? And it's sort of that metaphorical Stephen Covey thing where you spent your whole life building a ladder only to find out it was leaning against the wrong wall. So
Absolutely.
I care deeply about this. How would you suggest to someone who has no clue,
Yeah.
but is feeling that malaise, the
Yeah.
like, is this really, how would you expose yourself
Yeah.
to opportunities to light you up?
Well, I'm going to throw out what will sound like a radical idea, and then I'm going to tell a quick story. So the idea, which is going to sound radical, but it's actually not at all, is one idea. If you really need to knock yourself off center, take a sabbatical. So my friend Paul Millard, who's the author of a great book called Good Work, Highly recommend. And he also wrote The Pathless Path, which is a popular book. He makes the point that a 3-month sabbatical is less than 1% of the total number of months that you'll work in your career. And so it's not a big investment. It's not a big sacrifice when you consider that in almost 100% of cases, it changes lives. And it's story after story after story. So it's not an impossible thing. Like Paul points out that, we save to buy a house, we save to pay for our kids' education. But the idea of saving for a sabbatical is like verboten. It's not talked about. You should do it.
Right.
Everybody should do it. You should take a sabbatical. You should physically remove yourself from your situation. Go to Bali. Go do whatever. Go to your happy place. And if you what people find in 100% of cases is when they do that, when they create that space for serendipity to happen, it always happens. So that's a way if you really want to accelerate things. I did like when I went through mine was more of a slow process. I didn't even consider that a possibility. That would have been an incredibly powerful thing for me to do. Maybe in my mid to late 30s, it probably would have changed the trajectory of my life at a much earlier age. I have to tell this quick story though about the power of this type of like taking the red pill idea. So I started a company with a friend years ago, like a decade ago, and it was a company that went from 0 to 10 million in revenue very quickly. It was very successful right off the bat. And then the company ran into some speed bumps. Revenue actually started to decline. And my friend who I started the company with ran the company. He was the CEO. I was a passive investor and board member. So the company starts to have trouble right at the same time. He went through just a super nasty divorce, like terrible custody battle for his children, on and on. And I talked to him, and he was in a very dark place. Like, he was having thoughts about the worst things, let's just say. We ended up selling I ended up selling my stake in the company, lost touch with this guy for a while. I touched base with him again, like maybe 18 months later. And I was expecting that he was still going to be struggling, and he seemed so happy. And I said, Scott, you seem so happy. He's like, Kevin, I am in the best place I've been in maybe in my entire life. When things got to their worst, I remembered that as a kid, I enjoyed BMX racing. And so I did a Google search, and I realized that there's all these adult BMX leagues out there, believe it or not. So I joined this BMX league. I met this incredible community. I lost 30 pounds. I got in shape. I actually started dating a girl that I met through this BMX community. And he said, Kevin, and I get chills when I say this. He said, Kevin, I'm not exaggerating when I say this saved my life. And it's an amazing story about the power of just having that thing that exposes you to this truth that basically everything society tells us about success is wrong. And so I don't know how you get there without some sort of catalyst. So I'd say back to like, take a sabbatical, try some things, put yourself out there so that you're going to get caught up in something.
That's so good. There was this great, you probably, the Dirtbag Diaries.
Yeah, of course.
There was a great episode. The Dirtbag Diaries, for listeners, is a podcast that's been around forever. I almost feel like it must have been one of the first podcasts. Like, it's been around forever. And there was this great episode called The Year of Yes. And it was a woman who was like a marketing executive, and she won a trip to be on a cruise in Antarctica. And she remembers sitting on the boat with all the other guests and realizing there were capable people on the boat, and then there were incapable people on the boat.
Yeah.
And she was among the incapable people. Like, all the crew was capable. So she's like, she realized, like, if there was a zombie apocalypse, I would be the one creating the poster. Like, that's all I would know how to do. So she said, I decided to become capable. And what do you do when you want to become capable? You move to Idaho, is what she said, right? Because everybody in Idaho is capable. And being from the West, you know what that means. So I remember that so vividly, because the idea of like, just say yes to one little thing. Like, she did something dramatic. You've done something dramatic, but it doesn't have to be dramatic. Like, sign up for the art class you've always been thinking about. Learn how to do Tai Chi, like whatever. Get the fish aquarium that you dreamt of when you were 4.
100%.
Like, whatever it is, just open that little box again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rediscover childhood passions. have a bias towards saying yes. That's the
Yeah.
path.
Yeah. Okay. This was called opinion number 5. These are Kevin's most provocative opinions. Opinion number 5, we called the inverted calendar. And here's the quote:
Mm,
structure work around life passion, not the other way around.
right.
Um, you've talked about this, and I particularly liked. So tell us a little bit about how you plan your
Yeah.
weeks now around weather and climbing.
Yeah. So this actually came up because my friend Sahil Bloom, he's about to publish his first book, which is going to be great. But he asked me that question as part of an interview for his book. He's like, "Tell me how you plan a week." And I'd actually never thought about my system, but I definitely
Right.
have one now. I have to a disclaimer before I go through this is I recognize that this is a privilege, and note that I'm 54 years old. I've been working for 30 years. It's a privilege that I've earned over time, and so this is. But the takeaway is this should absolutely be the goal, to put yourself in a position where you have enough control to do this. So the way I plan each week, and it literally does kind of start with like on Sunday, I'll look at the weather for the week. And there's usually, especially this time of year in the winter, I have to pick the nice days, right? So if there's a couple of nice days that look really good, I kind of block those out for climbing. Climbing is, the number one priority on the calendar because it does require good weather and a little bit of planning in advance to find partners and so on. Then second comes any family commitments that I have, right? So I have one daughter in college, one who's still at home, living at home and goes to high school. There's not that many commitments, but I do have some family commitments with my wife and whatnot. Those get filled in. And then I have the luxury now of doing my work around those things. So, I believe that everyone, like the idea of a traditional retirement was always broken,
Right.
fatal, especially for knowledge
Right.
workers. I don't believe in traditional retirement. I do believe in defining success or what most people used to call retirement as gaining control of what you work on and when you do it and how you do it. So I don't take on any projects anymore where I don't have control of those things. So that allows me to do my work. And by the way, as a creatively wired individual, you may relate to this, Carl. Um, I need to work when I'm inspired anyway. Like the 9 to 5 punch the clock model never worked well for me, never worked well for a lot of creative types, knowledge workers, and so on. So that's kind of how I plan my week. It's like look at the weather, plan the climbing, block out the family stuff, and then fill in between.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's like back to Stephen Covey, the old big rocks idea, right? Of
That's
like
right.
getting the big rocks in early. So how would you adapt that for 35-year-old version of yourself? Like what's like, okay, I don't have a lot of control, but I've got
Yeah,
some. Like how would you start? What games could you play with your calendar when you have a boss, when you have somebody
that's
telling
right.
you what to do? Like
Yeah.
what little strategies or tricks do you have for those
Yeah.
guys?
The key strategy here is to think about it as a sliding scale. So the traditional retirement model is based on this crazy idea that like you work 9 to 5 for 40 years and then all of a sudden one day comes and you completely stop working and you
Crazy.
lose
Yeah, yeah.
all those skills and relationships, everything you've built up. I think of it instead as a sliding scale where like early in your career, hey, you got to do what you have to do to pay the bills. You might be grinding, you might be putting in a lot of hours at the office, but do it with the end in mind. And then as you advance through your career, slowly gain bits of control. And the first bit of control may look something like, I'm going to be home every night for dinner with my family. That's your first stake in the ground where you've regained, like, I've earned enough control over my career that I can say, I'm going to be home by 6 p.m. every night to have, that's important to me. And then it goes from there. It's like increment by increment. Then maybe you get to a point where you can work remotely 2 days a week or whatever that may look like for you. And slowly you gain control. And the idea is by the time you're, let's say, 20 years into your career, you're in your 40s, you should have a large degree of control. Now, a lot of people will say, well, no, if you're working a 9 to 5, you've always got a boss, and you don't have that much control. you have to be super deliberate about this. Like this has to be a goal because otherwise it's not going to happen on its own. Certainly the Borg, the corporate machine, is happy to have you just punching the clock for your entire life. So you have to take the reins. You have to make this happen. You have to choose jobs, for example, that will lead to more control.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I was thinking back of the sort of games that I played over the years where, we used to joke when we go skiing. It's an old joke now, but, if I got a call while skiing, I would just remind people that I was in a board meeting, right? Because the skis, the skis were boards, right? Or sorry, we're knee deep in challenges right now.
It's so absurd, those games we play. And it
Yeah,
gets back to this question of like, what is work? One of the things I love about climbing in
yeah,
flat
yeah,
irons is flat irons have full cell phone connectivity. So while I'm climbing, I'm thinking, I'm staying in touch with people. I'm sometimes texting or reading emails. So, in my case, I'm a marketing guy. So if I have a great marketing idea while I'm climbing, was I working or was I climbing? The answer
yeah,
is it's both. And, you mash it all
yep,
together.
yep. Yeah, that was opinion number 6 that I wanted to talk about. We called it non-linear knowledge work.
Yes.
Knowledge work happens. This is you. Knowledge work happens in fits and spurts, and it rejects the factory model of fixed hours. Let's talk about that a little bit. I particularly loved hearing you say once what you just said. Like, if I'm climbing for 4 hours and I have an idea, am I working or climbing?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me in knowledge work, like I spend 10 to 12 hours a week in the mountains. I track it. It's very intentional. It is my best work.
100%.
And I've started thinking about large chunks of unstructured time. I've started thinking about that 10 to 12 hours in the mountains as a prerequisite for continuing to do good work, not a reward for having done it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't work so often. Like try sometimes even, I mean, it took a number of years actually, even
Yeah.
with my wife to be like, no, this is work.
Well,
How do you deal with that? How do you think about that?
yeah, very similar to you. I mean, Naval Ravikant has a great take on this. He says, work like a lion. If you look at lions day to day, they're laying around most of the time. It doesn't look like they're doing anything. But when they're hunting, it's incredibly intense. It's an hour of incredibly intense work. And that is actually very much how most knowledge work happens. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a knowledge worker. Your job is not to move like a pile of rocks from this side of the road to the other side, which is what would be like linear work, right? It just takes a certain number of hours. Knowledge work requires like there has to be the inspiration and then the work. And you should work when you're sufficiently inspired so that you can have this incredible burst of productivity and creativity. It's like the lion hunting. The rest of the time may not look a lot like working, but to your point, Carl, it's just as important to the process because I mean, most knowledge workers know this implicitly. Like, let's say and by the way, when I talk about creativity and knowledge work, it could be a spreadsheet you're building. Like that's an incredibly creative activity. And let's say you're putting together a spreadsheet and you're having trouble cracking this one problem you're working on. A lot of times, the best way to solve that problem is not by just staring at the spreadsheet. Go for a walk or go for a hike or go to a museum. And it's amazing how your brain processes in a different mode. And how often have we had this happen where all of a sudden you have the epiphany, boom, I just cracked it. And now you come
Mhm.
back and do the work and it takes 10 minutes instead of staring at a screen for 4 hours.
Yeah, for sure. I'm tempted to go into some of the objections to all these things, because you certainly have heard them all, like, oh, cute of you to say that you can
Right.
do this, and you even mentioned like it is a privilege, and
Yeah.
there's a negative side to the word privilege at this point in the world,
Yeah.
and a huge piece of it that's true and needs to be
Yeah.
acknowledged. But instead of doing that, what I'd love to do is let's talk to people in our age cohort that are struggling with there's like this 45 to 55-year-old, let's just make it even more specific, 50 to 55-year-old who has options, right? Let's pretend like that's the audience today. How, and I wanted to talk about opinion This is opinion. We've sort of skipped around on the opinions, but this was labeled opinion number 7, the low cost ideal life. And you talked about making a list of the things that matter. And then you said most items on people's ideal life lists require very little money. And I think this is super powerful because, in fact, let me tell you a quick story. We moved to New Zealand. We were there for 4 years. And when we went to leave, my wife decided she wanted to go to interior design school at age 50, right? This was a dream of hers forever. She has every issue of Architectural Digest on the shelf. Like, she's been thinking about this since she was 4. And she got it. She applied to a design school in London thinking she wouldn't get in. She got in and it started 45 days later. And she was like, I'll surely defer. And the kids sort of sat her down and said, you've been deferring for 30 years. It's time to go. So she went. She gets there, and a couple weeks, and we had to stay in New Zealand to finish out the school year. So she went by herself at age 50 to London, figured it all out with all her luggage, right? She gets there. She's loving school. She's a couple weeks in, and somebody starts asking her about, like, what are your plans? It was a 1-year program. What are your plans? And she calls all excited about a job. And my son says to me, Mom's going to retire you. And I was like, that would be great. And everybody around the table had the same exact response, which was like, that would be great. And then 5 seconds later, like, no, wouldn't that be a terrible idea for you? And I said the same thing you did, which is, I'm never going to retire.
Yeah.
And my son was like, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'll just stop doing the things I don't like, and I'll do more of the things I do like. And he, being like a 14-year-old that had some insight, he was like, make me a list. And we went through like the things I don't like. And then he said after each one, would you make more or less money if you stopped today? And every one I was like, well, actually, it's not the point, but I would probably make more money if I stopped doing that. And I just came to this conclusion that if you've got options at that point in your life, yes, it may be a privilege you worked really hard for, but you have the options. It's just a question of giving yourself permission to do it.
Yeah. 100%.
So I'm sort of curious about how you got there in this, specifically like this low cost ideal life.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And first thing I'll say is lots of people have made enough money that they have options, but very few people actually build the life they want. And that's always been a head scratcher to me. And it's because of fear, and it's because they're not deliberate about it. And so what you referenced, and this is probably the most important thing I can say on this podcast today, is as part of my reboot, I developed this exercise years ago. I call it the ideal end state exercise. It's a kind of a unsexy name for a very powerful exercise. And
it's from a marketing guy. Come on,
I know. I'm still, it's been years and I'm still looking for a great name, but it seems to click with people because it sort of describes itself, right? So it's similar to the exercise your son challenged you to do, which is you get out your notes app on your phone or a piece of paper. And in this case, you literally just write down bullet points. Like, if you could have any life you want, what would it look like? Now, to be clear, this is not a bucket list. It's not a list of things you want to accomplish or do. This is a state of being. So, for example, on my list, it says control 80% of my time, have financial assets to fund this lifestyle indefinitely, get plenty of sunshine every day, investing in my inner circle of 5 closest friends. It's
Kevin, what are you doing? Are you actually where is that? Where are you reading that right now, or you have it memorized?
Yeah, I have it memorized and I'm reading it right now. It's
somewhere where you see it all the time.
It's in the notes app of my iPhone. Yeah, it's pinned.
Fascinating. And you didn't have to go find a new app. You didn't have to go research for 17 days which note-taking app you just use. Oh, there's this crazy one called Apple Notes.
Yeah, exactly. I use Apple Notes. That's how I write all of my X posts too, by the way. Thousands.
Okay,
and thousands.
I was just struck by the fact of how quickly you pulled that up.
Yeah. I didn't even pull it up because I refer to it so often. and I talk about it so much, I know what mine is. And, it should be aspirational. Like it should be like, really, what would your ideal life look like? And it may take years or decades to get there. Now, the reason this exercise is powerful is twofold. Number one, it makes painfully clear the disconnects between what you say you want and your current behavior. And I will tell you, over the years, I've gone through this exercise with probably over 100 people, literal billionaires, all the way down to college students. In every single case, there were, including mine, there were huge gaps between what you say you want and what you're doing today. So a simple example, the one I like to pick on actually, is if you say you want financial freedom, which means like you have financial resources that allow you to live this lifestyle, why are you spending money on stuff that you say you don't care about, that is not on your list? Biggest offender might be like a fancy car or something. Like it doesn't, if it says on your list that you want to drive a Ferrari, great. If that brings you joy, if that's part of your ideal life, knock yourself out. But if it's not on the list and you're driving a Ferrari, that's a huge, use, a big sink for financial resources. So what's the disconnect? So that's, and there's lots of examples. It makes those disconnects really clear. The second takeaway that's even more powerful, in 99% of cases, when people finish their list and look back at it, they're like, oh my gosh, almost nothing on this list takes tons of money. Like, I don't need the $20 million I thought I needed to quote unquote retire. I can start living this, like pieces of this life today. It's all about just having the courage to make those deliberate steps. And so it's an incredibly powerful exercise. And that is the answer. Like whether you're 50 or whether you're 30, it's never too late, because once you have a clear definition of what it is that you want out of life, all you have to do is start aligning your behavior every day, and it compounds very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting that, that gap. My, first book was called The Behavior Gap, and that gap, I've got a little sketch that I drew that has what you say in one circle. It's a Venn diagram with no overlap. So
Yes.
really it's just two circles,
Yeah.
right? What you say and what you do with a
Yeah.
gap. And I've been really curious about that gap. Like you, like, why is it that we avoid that gap? And here's a question I want to ask you. Let's pretend like you have a bunch of stuff, because that gap represents, again, to be clear, the gap between what you say you want and what you're actually doing represents inauthentic behavior.
Yep.
Right. And it may be unconscious. We may not be thinking about it, and there's a strong disincentive for anybody to ask you about that gap. Right. Like, so who do you have in your life? How do you expose that gap in your own life? Is there a person? Is there a system you go through so that you can close it over time?
Well, that's a great question. And I did not have that person in my life, which is why it took me so long to figure all this stuff out. I was my own accountability partner. But I do think that highlights the importance of curating your inner circle. And your inner circle doesn't mean just people that you like to go do stuff with, you're friendly with, whatever. It means people that inspire you and challenge you. That's probably the number one criteria. It's people who want to grow themselves and will challenge you to grow. And I didn't really take that to heart myself until the past few years. After moving to Boulder, I essentially rebuilt my inner circle. And now I'm surrounded by people who do really challenge me in a big way. And they inspire me with their own growth and the way they're challenging themselves. And I reciprocate. I challenge them in a huge way. But if you don't have that, that's why this exercise is powerful, because it's like a self-accountability mechanism where you say, like, I'll give you a very specific example from my life. When I talked about, rebooting in my mid 40s, I did this exercise, and on my list, it said, I want to be able to climb outside when the weather's nice. Well, I can't do that in Dallas, Texas. So it checks yourself. You check yourself by saying, like, do I have the balls? No. Do I have the balls to actually go for it, to actually relocate my family so that I can be closer to the rock, so that I can climb on days when the weather's nice? Because Otherwise, I'm just kidding myself. I should move that item off the list if I'm not being authentic about it. But if I am authentic, then I need to take those scary steps.
Yeah. What's you spend plenty of time in the mountains, and I know that comes with lots of introspection. What's the sort of tiny but frightening inauthentic behavior that's there right now? Like, what gap do you have right now that you're kind of avoiding?
Um, yeah, so it's probably like the classic one is I have achieved by almost any measure, I have achieved financial independence. So money is not something I really need to worry about. I can live my current lifestyle, which is exactly the lifestyle I want. I can live it indefinitely with, while doing little or no, paid work, right? But still, it's something that's ingrained in my brain, that desire or that need at a primal level to like be an earner. It's still like a little piece of my identity still says like, oh, I've got to have a cool job title, or I got to be doing something cool work wise, or I got to be earning a certain amount. It's hard to let go of that. It really is.
Mm. So if you were to draw that Venn diagram, and one circle would say, I don't really care about that stuff, and the other circle, you still care a little bit.
I still do care a little bit. And you know what? I also think in a way that's fine, because I talk about how like your identity is a sliding scale. And, at some
Yeah.
point, work was like 100% of my identity. Now
Yeah.
it is probably like 20%. I still love, like, I love the projects that I work on. And then that within that 20% is that sort of need to be known as a good business person, or like, a capable person. And that's okay. Like I don't try to fight that too much, because it's a small enough piece of who I am. Now, where it would be really worthy of challenging is if I was financially independent, said I wanted control of my time, but like still was grinding away 60 hours a week in the office, which, by the way,
Yeah.
a lot of people do. I know I have a friend who's a CEO who's worth 9 figures, and he still grinds away in the office, even though he will tell you, I'm miserable. I have a miserable life. It's hard to let go of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a friend who says he's retired and still works 60 hours a week. Yeah, it's true. Let's talk a little bit about making. So Dan Sullivan, the strategic coach, has this idea of your future always bigger than your past.
Yeah.
And there's people listening that are at the age where they or their friends are sort of shutting things down. And you've got a bunch of friends, I'm sure, or people at least that given your age, where people are starting to think like, oh, I'm going to start winding things down.
Yeah.
And that drives me crazy, right?
Yeah.
I was trying to, and I remember hearing a story about a 92-year-old that just started his first venture capital fund, and he's only making 25-year investments. Like, I want to hang out with that guy.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you think about making your future, like continuing to do things that light you up rather than starting to slow things down?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the analogy I like to use is like humans are like sharks. We need to keep moving or we die. And that's true in both a literal and a metaphorical sense. Like literally, if you
Right.
stop moving your body, you're going to die a lot sooner. But also in all aspects of your life, you got to be moving and growing for sure. I think the thing that does change over time is the measure of success. So I've mostly stopped measuring success in anything I do by like status or dollars. Instead, I focus on things like meaning, like how, am I doing more, like using that ideal end state as my barometer for success? Like, am I moving closer to that or further away? I truly do believe, like, I don't just say this to like try to convince myself. I truly do believe that I'm 54 years old. I think I will climb my hardest routes in rock climbing, and I will do my best work in the next 5 years. And then at the end of that 5 years, I might say the same thing. I don't know. We'll see. But I truly believe that physically, spiritually, emotionally, like I'm growing in all those areas, not shrinking.
Mm.
And it becomes self-fulfilling. That's the thing. It's like when you say that, that informs your behavior, but I actually think there's even more to it, like at a metaphysical, energetic layer or level, putting those thoughts out there does something in the universe that tends to manifest. And
Yeah.
manifested behaviors and serendipity and all sorts of things that makes it true. Almost just you say it and it becomes true.
Yeah. Yeah. let's let's circle back real quick to this Venn diagram, these two circles that are not overlapping, and the idea of inauthentic behavior. Because I've been curious about, my definition of real financial planning is aligning your use of capital, and that's time, money, energy, and attention. Your use of capital with what's important to you. And every time I go through that exercise, which I probably think about it almost every day, because I've got a statement. I call it a statement of financial purpose. I've got one too. Time with my family, mainly outside, and serving in my community. That's what really matters to me. But then I'll check my use of my time, just with my screen time, even on my phone, and realize, like, I claim to not care about politics. Well, how come I was on that website
Yeah.
for 90 minutes today? Or I don't care really about sports. You spent 2 hours on ESPN and you didn't have a
Yeah.
chance to go backcountry skiing. Like that inauthentic behavior. And
Yeah.
you said you have friends that will call you on that, or you'll call them on that.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Well,
Like, walk me through it. Thean you tell me a story recently where somebody was like, yo, Kevin, I see this, or you did the same to somebody else?
yeah. Well, first, let me say there's an idea in there that you have to embrace, and people will resist this idea. But the reality is, money is neither finite nor zero sum. Meaning that, like, you can go make more money than you make today, and you making more money doesn't mean that someone else makes less money necessarily. Um, Time, on the other hand, is absolutely finite and zero sum. You have 24 hours in a day. That's never going to change. But more importantly, every hour you use in that day doing one thing can never be used to do something else. It's gone. Right. And so that is a super important concept to understand, is that time and more importantly, energy, which is even shorter supply, is
Right.
is the real currency. And people will say, they'll roll their eyes, they'll say, whatever, Kevin. Um, but sure, I sure would like to be a billionaire. And to them, I say, well, okay, here, let me pose a question to you. Warren Buffett is worth over $100 billion, but I think he's 94 years old. Would you trade places with him? Because I guarantee you, Warren Buffett would trade places with you. If Warren Buffett could be 35 and broke, he would do that deal in a heartbeat. So that tells you something, right? You probably wouldn't trade places with Warren Buffett. So you really don't value money as the primary measure. You value time. You just haven't fully embraced it. And I think that the mental switch there is, by fully embracing it, now you start to align your behaviors accordingly. And so when so you asked for a specific example. I've got a friend who lives here in Boulder, and if he listens to this, he'll know I'm talking about him.
Right.
He's done extremely well in private equity. Let's just say he's an ultra high net worth individual, and I'll call him out all the time. I tell him, "You're a terrible rich person," because for the simple the example that comes to mind, because it's really happened, is we were going on a trip together. And we rode to the airport, and I was like, hey, what time do you want to pick me up from my house? And he gave me a time that was like 2.5 hours before the flight. And I was like, why do we need to go so early? He's like, oh, well, when we get to the economy parking lot, we have to jump on a shuttle and then take that to I was like, dude, are you crazy? Do you realize you're worth like $100 million or whatever? Like, your time is the most important asset you have. You should not be parking in economy, right? You're saving $10 a day and costing yourself like 2 extra hours. So that's a simple example where you call people out, like, on that alignment issue, on that Venn diagram you talked about.
Yeah. What is there? I'm going to ask one more time because I'm super curious about it. Is there anything that you're worried about being called out on?
I mean, this is going to sound
Don't
probably a
worry.
little,
No, it's just you and I. Like nobody's
yeah,
listening.
yeah, exactly. It's going to sound maybe a little bit arrogant, but because so nothing major, I don't think. I'd have to think about that a little bit. Now, I'd have to say that's because I've made some pretty radical changes over the past 6 years. Now, 6 years ago, I would have been able to name 4 or 5 things, which I named like the climbing thing as one example, like living in Dallas. That was a big gap. But honestly, like I've closed most of those gaps, which is why I do feel qualified to talk about this stuff because, the my Twitter bio or my X bio, the first line on it says, "I learned everything the hard way, so you don't have to." It's
Mm,
not like I knew all these things back in my 20s and 30s and led this perfect life. I did everything
mm.
wrong and then realized it and made the corrections. And if there's any claim to fame I have, it's that I was willing to make the bold moves required to course correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. Kevin, as we sort of wrap up here, how do you think about enough?
Yeah. That's been a really hot topic on X lately. I don't know if you spend much time there,
I
but
try to avoid it. Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. The I posted something a few weeks ago called "Know Your Number" because when we say enough, we all know what we're usually talking about, right? Which is a dollar figure, right? And most people, I gave a talk on this uh, to a pretty big crowd about a month ago, and I said, most of you in the audience have a number in your mind that represents enough. Like if I had $20 million or 5 million or even $1 million, whatever, that would be enough. And a funny story is Harvard Business School actually did a study on this. I don't know if you heard about this. They asked 2,000 people who were all had a net worth of at least $1 million. So it was like wide spectrum from people who were worth $1 million all the way up to people worth like $200 million. They said, "How much money would you need to be satisfied?" What surprised them is across the board, the answer was the same. Can you guess what the answer was?
Yeah. I
Twice
think I
as
saw.
much.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Some more.
Yeah. So twice as
Yeah.
much was kind of the consistent answer. So that tells us like something's broken. And so whatever number it is you have in your mind, you need to base that on something. And that's why this ideal end state life is a great start. Then you translate that. There's an exercise I have called Know Your Number, and it's loosely based on the FIRE principles or the 4% rule, if you've heard of that. And it basically helps you arrive. There's a lot of tips and tricks and nuances to it that helps you arrive at a number. And in almost all cases, that number is dramatically lower than most people think. And honestly, that was so I was 10 years ago, I was climbing and I ran into this other climber on the same route who told me about Mr. Money Mustache, who was like a big, he popularized the idea of the 4% rule. Mr. Money Mustache, his name's Pete Adney, lives right down the road from me. He's a friend of mine now. But I read Pete's blog and it blew my mind because what I didn't realize, and look, I've got a degree in mathematics. I've been in finance most of my life. I'm good with numbers, but it didn't, I still thought I needed more. And what I realized, the epiphany for me was once I knew what my real number was, like, oh, I've got enough. I just need to embrace it. The problem is society will tell you to stay on the hamster wheel your whole life. So you have to be willing to go against the grain if you really want to have enough. So there's the pragmatic, the number side, but then there's the willingness to accept that you have enough.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I've spent a lot of time on this topic, and I do think it's a different kind of work. Like the getting the tactical number figured out is an important part of it, but we all know that as soon as you get a number, no amount of reassurance will be enough, right? Like
Never.
having enough is actually, I don't think a destination or a number. I think it's a thing you have to be,
Yeah.
and it's a different kind of work, right? Like I always wonder, like, wouldn't it be interesting if money could talk to us?
Well,
Because I feel like money would say to us, like, you gave me jobs I can't do. You know, like I feel like it'd be like a beast of burden. Like, I can't do this happiness thing you're telling me to do.
yeah.
You know, I can't do this enough thing.
Well, and I have to say, I'm glad you sort of went here at the end of our conversation, because this is kind of a beautiful way to tie everything that we've talked about together, because you can start to see how all these principles we've talked about are very related, right? So we talked about minimalism, right? So by living a minimalist life, you're lowering your burn rate and increasing the joy in your life, which makes it easier to have enough. By identifying what your ideal life looks like, you can, in a very tangible way, understand what you need to do to get that life. By knowing your number, you don't have to, you have a firm number that you can start to work with. And there's all these tricks you can play to start bringing that number down. I've written about this extensively on X. And so all these concepts we talk about are very much related. And that's where the real magic is.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, Kevin, let's wrap with just this last question. You mentioned that you've still got a son at home. How old is your son?
It's a daughter, and she's 17.
Sorry, daughter, 17. Let's pretend like 20 years from now, I'm still doing this show. And we have your 37-year-old daughter on. And I ask her what money means to her. What would you hope she would say?
Great question. And I hope that she would say that her dad really modeled a healthy relationship with money. That's the first thing I hope. The follow, if she was asked a follow-on question, I hope she would say that the gist of it was that money is for living and not vice versa. Mm-hmm. You know, money is not the measure of a successful life. On our refrigerator here at home, there's a Post-it note on it that I hung a long time ago that says, Dahlstrom's invest in experiences. Look, we've done very well financially. But if you looked at our life, you would see that we don't buy a lot of things. We go big on experiences. And it turns out that the best experiences often don't cost very much anyway. And so to me, that is the healthy relationship with money, is to use money as a means, not an end.
So good, Kevin. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
You bet. This was awesome. Yes, some wonderful questions. I love to get off the beaten path.
Yeah. Cheers, Kevin. "50 Fires" is a production of Blind Nil Audio in association with The Roost. I'm looking forward to our next conversation around the fire. Cheers, my friends.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Blind Nil Audio, nor Magnolia.